I never expected to feel something so real for someone I was never supposed to love. It wasn't sudden. It grew in silence, in stolen glances, quiet nights, and words we never dared to say. He wasn't just a part of my home. He became a silence that filled it. And when he left, I finally understood what it meant to love someone by letting them go. The house had always been quiet, not the kind of silence that comforts, but the kind that hums just beneath the surface, too still, too controlled. Rowan Ellis had grown used to that stillness, especially after his father passed. At 18, he found himself navigating a world where his mother's presence was fleeting, more like a whisper in passing than a grounding force. Her career consumed her days, her evenings filled with events and obligations that rarely included him. Simon Kessler entered their lives 3 years ago. He wasn't loud or forceful. He arrived with measured words, calm gestures, and a smile that never reached too far. A philosophy professor, Simon spoke in a tone that felt like soft pages turning. He never tried to replace anyone. He simply existed, quietly, thoughtfully. In the beginning, Rowan kept his distance. He wasn't angry, just tired of forming connections that time or circumstance would inevitably unravel. But over time, something shifted. Simon was patient, always available for conversation without pushing for it. He noticed when Rowan lingered near the kitchen, unsure whether to speak. He remembered what books Rowan was reading and asked about them without expectation. It was subtle, but it mattered. Their bond didn't happen overnight. It built itself in layers, over shared late-night tea, over quiet dinners when his mother worked late, over silence that didn't need to be filled. Simon listened when Rowan spoke, but more importantly, he noticed when Rowan didn't. That awareness felt foreign, almost uncomfortable, like stepping into sunlight after being indoors too long. Rowan wasn't used to being seen like that. He started looking forward to their time alone, not for what was said, but for how it felt. Comfortable, safe, present. He would come home from school and find Simon at the kitchen counter grading papers, glasses low on his nose, soft music playing from a speaker tucked behind the spice rack. There was always tea, always calm. One evening, the electricity went out. A storm had rolled in suddenly, drenching the streets and darkening the sky before anyone had time to react. Rowan came downstairs to find Simon lighting candles. The warm, flickering glow softened the sharp edges of the kitchen. They sat at the table with mugs of warm tea, listening to the rain. It should have been unremarkable. Nothing happened. They didn't talk much. But something about the quiet companionship in that moment lodged itself in Rowan's memory. The way Simon looked up when Rowan entered the room. The way his expression shifted from distraction to attention. It made Rowan pause. From then on, Rowan became more attuned to the space Simon occupied in his life. He noticed the way Simon always left a light on for him when he came home late. The way he folded laundry with careful precision, even Rowan's clothes. He remembered how Simon had once stood silently in the doorway when Rowan was having a panic attack, not saying anything, just waiting for him to breathe again. It wasn't affection in the traditional sense. It was presence. Reliable, grounding, real. And Rowan needed that more than he cared to admit. Their interactions remained appropriate. There were no lingering touches, no accidental brushes. Yet something hung in the air, a kind of awareness. Rowan began catching himself watching Simon when he thought the man wasn't looking. He studied the lines in his face, the thoughtful way he moved through the house. There was no rush in Simon's world, and that lack of urgency drew Rowan in. He started choosing the kitchen over his bedroom. Even when his mother was gone, which was often, he stayed downstairs longer. Sometimes they would read at the same table, 2 separate books, 2 separate silences that blended into one. There was a rhythm to it. Simon never overstepped. He never pried or hinted. But Rowan could feel something unspoken in the spaces between their words. A growing gravity that neither of them acknowledged. He tried not to overanalyze it. Maybe it was just gratitude. Maybe it was just the ache of wanting to belong. But deep down, Rowan felt the edges of something he couldn't name. And in the quiet of that house, where nothing ever echoed too loud, that something began to grow. The days moved quietly, but something in the air had shifted. Rowan noticed in the way he hesitated before entering a room Simon was in, how his breath caught when their eyes met across the kitchen. There was nothing overt, nothing that anyone else would notice, but Rowan felt it, a tension that wasn't discomfort, it was anticipation. Simon had never changed the way he treated him. Still polite, still careful, still calm. But Rowan could sense the pause in his movements when they passed each other in narrow spaces, the momentary stillness in his voice when their conversations drifted into more personal territory. The space between them had become charged. It wasn't about what was said. It was what wasn't. Rowan found himself lingering longer in shared spaces. His room felt too empty, too far away. He spent hours downstairs reading in the living room where Simon worked. They didn't always talk. Often, it was just the quiet sound of pages turning and soft music playing from Simon's laptop. But Rowan preferred that silence to the hollow kind he used to know. One evening, the lights were dim. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting a gentle gray over the living room. Simon sat on the couch, reviewing notes for a lecture, while Rowan curled up in a chair across from him, a half-read book resting on his knees. The soft buzz of the lamp filled the silence between them. Every so often, Rowan would glance up, pretending to stretch, just to look at Simon's face. He studied the lines around his mouth, the way his fingers moved over the page, slow and deliberate. He told himself it was curiosity, but the flutter in his chest betrayed something else. He had stopped trying to name the feeling. It had become easier to live in the moments instead of questioning them. The comfort of shared space, the way Simon's presence calmed the chaos in Rowan's mind. Still, late at night, when Rowan lay awake in bed, he thought about the way Simon's eyes lingered just a second too long when they said goodnight. He remembered the way his voice softened when Rowan was upset, how his gaze never turned away when Rowan looked vulnerable. He began to crave those moments, not in a way that felt dangerous, but in a way that felt necessary. They had dinner together most nights now. His mother was usually working late or traveling. Simon cooked simple meals, quiet and precise, and always made sure there was enough for Rowan. There was comfort in the routine, plates clinking, chairs sliding, quiet chewing, occasional comments about books or films. It felt like a rhythm, like something stable. But there were pauses now, moments where their eyes met and neither of them looked away fast enough. There was a softness in those silences that lingered long after the dishes were cleaned. Rowan didn't speak of it. Neither did Simon. But the awareness was there, blooming in the spaces where words should have been. One weekend, Rowan's mother left for a conference. The house felt even quieter without her footsteps echoing down the hall. That evening, they watched a film together. Something slow and emotional. Rowan barely registered the plot. His mind was too focused on the way Simon sat, one leg tucked beneath him, hand resting close to Rowan's side on the couch. They didn't touch, but the space between them felt unbearably small. As the credits rolled, Simon stayed seated, eyes fixed on the dark screen. Rowan didn't move either. His heart beat in his ears, loud in the silence. He could feel the heat of Simon's body just inches away. No words passed between them. None were needed. In that quiet moment, the air was thick with something unspoken, a kind of intimacy that was deeper than touch, more vulnerable than confession. Rowan didn't know what came next. He didn't know if anything ever would. But in that space, between breath and silence, between caution and longing, he felt something begin to settle, something that had no name, but every weight. And Simon, though still, did not pull away. The weeks that followed felt unreal, like Rowan was living in a space suspended between reality and dream. Everything around him remained unchanged. The same kitchen tiles, the same garden view from his window, the same quiet hum of the house. Yet inside, everything was different. He felt it in the way his breath caught when Simon entered a room, in the way his heart quickened at the sound of his voice. He began avoiding mirrors. He didn't want to look himself in the eye and ask the questions that pressed against the edges of his thoughts. Instead, he let himself move through the days like someone floating just beneath the surface of water, quiet, observant, unseen. Simon, too, had grown quieter. He no longer initiated conversations in the same way. His touches, once casual, brief, appropriate, were now rare, almost self-conscious. And Rowan noticed everything. The glances that ended too fast, the pauses before speaking, the slight distance Simon kept between them. It was as if both of them were holding their breath. One evening, after a long day of school and silence, Rowan returned home to find Simon alone in the study. The room smelled of old books and cedar, lit only by the low glow of a desk lamp. He stood at the threshold for a moment, unsure of whether to enter. But something about Simon's stillness pulled him in. He stepped inside and sat in the armchair across from him. Simon looked up from his notes, his eyes meeting Rowan's for just a second too long before returning to the page. The silence between them stretched. Rowan wanted to say something, anything, but his voice caught in his throat. The weight of all the unsaid things they'd carried over the past weeks had become unbearable. "I don't know what this is," he said finally, the words barely above a whisper. "But I know it's something." Simon didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the paper in front of him, but Rowan could see his fingers tighten slightly around the pen. When he finally looked up, there was no anger or fear in his gaze, only sadness. "I felt it too," Simon said quietly. "But we can't. We shouldn't." Rowan nodded slowly. He knew the logic. He understood the boundary that stood between them. But knowing didn't dull the ache that had taken root inside him. The conversation ended there, but everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. The distance between them wasn't physical. It was emotional, ethical, something deeper than circumstance. That night, Rowan didn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, every breath sharp and shallow. The memory of Simon's voice lingered in his ears, as did the look in his eyes, a mix of regret and restraint. By morning, something inside Rowan had changed. He couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't act like what he felt was a passing confusion or misplaced gratitude. It was more. He didn't know what to do with that truth, but he could no longer ignore it. 3 days later, the house was quiet. His mother had left for a weekend trip, and the air inside felt still, heavy. Simon stood by the kitchen window, holding a mug of coffee, eyes fixed on the gray sky. Rowan entered slowly, unsure of what he was doing but certain he had to say something. He walked up beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I meant what I said," Rowan said softly. Simon closed his eyes for a moment, as if bracing against something. Then he turned to face him fully. There was a tremble in his expression, not of fear, but of decision. "I need to go," he said, voice barely audible. For a while, the words landed like ice in Rowan's chest. But he didn't argue. He knew. He had known this moment was coming from the instant they'd acknowledged what had always been there. "When?" he asked. "Tomorrow," Simon replied. No further words were exchanged. They stood there, side by side, staring out at the fading light. And though they were still close in space, the emotional distance between them had never felt wider. That night, Rowan sat alone in his room, staring at the ceiling once again. But this time, the silence felt final. And in a strange way, he felt relief. Because the one person who could have broken something inside him had chosen instead to protect it. Simon was leaving, not because he didn't care, but because he did. The morning Simon left, the house felt unnaturally still. Not the usual quiet, but something heavier. The kind that fills a space once occupied by someone whose presence had become part of its rhythm. Rowan didn't come downstairs to say goodbye. He listened instead, first to the soft hum of footsteps, then to the closing of the front door, and finally to the silence that followed. He remained in bed for a long time that day. Not asleep, not crying, just still. Simon didn't leave a note. Rowan hadn't expected one. Their final exchange had been enough. There were no promises, no goodbyes disguised as hope. Just the unspoken understanding that this was the only path left to preserve what was still unbroken. Weeks passed, and the absence carved its shape into Rowan's daily life. At first, he drifted. School became a blur of noise and movement that never reached him. Meals were eaten in silence. His mother returned from her trip, and didn't ask about Simon. She was quieter than usual, though. She must have sensed the shift, even if she didn't understand it. Rowan began to spend more time alone, not out of anger or grief, but necessity. He needed space to think, to breathe, to understand what had happened without collapsing under the weight of it. He started journaling. At first, just fragments, thoughts, feelings, disconnected memories. Eventually, those fragments formed sentences, then pages. He didn't write about what almost happened. He wrote about what did. The silence, the closeness, the understanding that had passed between them without words. He wrote about the stillness of those nights, the comfort of being seen, the ache that came from losing it. Months passed. Seasons shifted. Rowan graduated and moved to a nearby college. Not far, but far enough. He rented a small apartment above a bookstore, surrounded himself with books and light and quiet places to think. He didn't make many friends at first, but he found a kind of peace in his solitude. He kept writing. One day, he came across a folder on his old laptop labeled Letters. Inside were a dozen unfinished drafts, each one addressed to Simon. None of them had been sent. Some were only a few lines. Others were pages long. Each one tried, in its own way, to explain something he still didn't fully understand. But there was one he couldn't delete. It had been written nearly a year after Simon left. Unlike the others, it wasn't emotional. It was clear, deliberate. He had written it late one night after walking home in the rain, soaked and cold, and realizing that the weight in his chest had changed. It wasn't pain anymore. It was memory. He opened that file now, reading the words he'd once written with trembling fingers. You didn't leave because you were weak. You left because you were strong enough to know we couldn't exist in that space any longer. I hated you for that at first. I wanted you to stay. But now I see what you gave me, space to become myself. Not through what we were, but through what we never let ourselves be. Rowan sat back in his chair, the cursor blinking at the end of the paragraph. He hadn't touched the file since writing it, but something inside him had changed. He clicked print. The next day, he folded the letter carefully, slipped it into an envelope, and walked it down to the post office. He didn't know if the address was still valid. He didn't even know if Simon would open it, but sending it felt like a final breath being exhaled. It wasn't closure in the dramatic sense. It was quiet, like most things between them had been. Honest, respectful. That evening, Rowan walked through the city, the cool wind brushing against his face. The past still lived in him, those quiet nights, the soft tea steam, the lingering tension, but it no longer controlled him. He carried the weight of that chapter not as a wound, but as a scar. Faded but permanent. A part of his story. Not something to erase, but something to learn from. Simon Kessler found it tucked between grocery flyers and a utilities bill, the return address handwritten in a familiar script. He stood at the kitchen counter for a long moment, the envelope resting in his palm, untouched. It had been nearly 2 years, and yet, seeing his name in that handwriting unraveled something quiet inside him. He opened it slowly. The letter was brief. No dramatic revelations, no confessions. Just words. Thoughtful, measured, like Rowan himself. Simon read it once, then again. The second time, he let the silence of his apartment settle around him, letting every sentence sink in. There was no anger, no blame, only clarity. Rowan had written about memory, about silence, about what it meant to be seen without being claimed. He didn't ask for anything, not forgiveness, not closure, only understanding. And somehow, that was more than enough. Simon folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on the edge of his desk. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting warm light across the bookshelves. He sat in his chair and allowed himself a moment to breathe, to feel what he hadn't allowed himself to feel in all that time: relief. Not because anything had been resolved, but because it had been acknowledged. Elsewhere in a small college town, Rowan sat at the window of a quiet cafe, his journal open beside a half-empty cup of tea. He didn't know if Simon had received the letter. He hadn't expected a reply. That wasn't the purpose. Writing it had been about release. He no longer carried the weight of what could have been. Instead, he honored what was, a connection that had shaped him, challenged him, and ultimately led him toward himself. That connection, though never fully spoken aloud, had given him a rare and quiet gift. The understanding that love, in its purest form, doesn't always need to be acted on to be real. Some stories are meant to exist in the quiet spaces between people, in what is withheld, in what is remembered. Rowan glanced down at his journal. A new page waited to be filled, but this time there was no ache behind the pen, just a soft calm, a readiness to begin something new. In another city, Simon stood by his bookshelf and reached for a collection of essays on memory and time. He hadn't taught in over a year, having taken a sabbatical to think, to heal. The letter had reminded him of the importance of words, how they could carry truth more gently than anything else. He returned to his desk, opened his laptop, and began typing. Not an email, not a reply, but a new lecture. One about human connection, about the lines we walk between intimacy and restraint, about how sometimes the greatest acts of care are the ones we choose not to take. As the sun disappeared, two lives continued forward, separate but not disconnected. Their story was never about crossing a line. It was about choosing not to,